You don't usually recognize manipulation while it's happening, not because you're unaware, but because nothing feels dramatic enough to question. It often begins as a conversation that seems normal. A small pause after you speak. A gentle shift in tone. A sentence that sounds supportive but leaves you slightly unsure of your own position. You walk away feeling calm on the surface, yet something stays unsettled underneath, like the interaction moved a few inches in a direction you didn't consciously choose. There's no pressure, no obvious demand, just a quiet sense that your perspective softened faster than you expected. That's what makes subtle manipulation difficult to notice. It doesn't look like control. It looks like cooperation. It feels like someone understanding you, while slowly guiding where your attention settles. And because nothing feels overtly wrong, your mind searches for another explanation. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you overreacted. Maybe you're just reading too much into it. But what if that quiet hesitation isn't confusion at all? What if it's the first signal that influence has already begun shaping the space between you and the other person? Before you can recognize how manipulation works, you have to understand why it rarely appears as force. It appears as alignment, and that's exactly why most people never realize when it starts. Subtle manipulation doesn't begin with pressure. It begins with framing. The quiet way a situation is presented before you've fully decided how you feel about it. Someone might introduce an idea as a concern rather than a request. They might position their opinion as something gentle, thoughtful, or protective. And because the tone feels reasonable, your attention shifts toward maintaining harmony instead of examining direction. Nothing is forced. The options still exist. But certain choices begin to feel heavier, not because they're wrong, but because the atmosphere around them changes. You may notice yourself explaining more than usual, clarifying your intentions, softening your boundaries before anyone has openly challenged them. It doesn't feel like giving in. It feels like adjusting, like being considerate, cooperative, emotionally aware. And that's the point where framing quietly works, because when influence is subtle, it doesn't try to overpower your thinking. It moves alongside it. It gently redirects where your focus lands, highlighting one perspective while letting another fade into the background. Most people imagine manipulation as something aggressive or calculated, but the reality is often quieter. A suggestion placed at the right moment, a tone that makes disagreement feel slightly uncomfortable, a pause that invites you to fill the silence with more explanation than you originally intended. The interaction still feels mutual, still feels respectful, yet somewhere beneath the surface, the balance begins to shift. Not through force, but through how the moment is shaped before you even notice it. Subtle manipulation doesn't only work because of what someone else does. It works because it touches something already sensitive inside you. A need to keep things smooth. A quiet instinct to reduce tension before it grows. The awareness that notices emotional shifts long before they're spoken aloud. If you're attentive to atmosphere, you probably sense discomfort early. You notice the slight change in someone's tone, the hesitation in their response, the moment when a conversation starts leaning in a certain direction. And part of you wants to adjust, not because you're weak, but because you value connection. That responsiveness is a strength, but it also creates openings where influence can quietly settle. And here's the uncomfortable part most people avoid acknowledging. You've probably done this too, not with malice, not as a calculated move, but there have been moments when you softened your language to make someone more agreeable, when you framed a request gently so resistance felt unnecessary, when concern became a subtle way of guiding a decision instead of openly asking for it. The line between natural influence and manipulation isn't always obvious, especially when both people believe they're just trying to keep things balanced. Recognizing that doesn't make you manipulative. It makes you aware of how human interactions actually work. Because subtle influence isn't a trait that belongs to others. It's a dynamic that emerges whenever awareness, sensitivity, and unspoken expectations meet. And understanding that is where real clarity begins. You might notice it in moments that seem harmless on the surface. A conversation where support feels slightly heavier than encouragement. Someone says, "I just want what's best for you." But the timing of the words makes you question a decision you felt clear about only minutes earlier. Nothing is said directly, yet the emotional weight of the interaction changes. Sometimes it appears as silence. A pause that lasts just long enough that you feel responsible for filling it. You start explaining more than you planned, clarifying things that didn't need clarification. The space subtly invites you to carry the emotional effort of the conversation, even though no one explicitly asked you to. Other times, it shows up through reframing. A casual remark shifts how your experience is interpreted. Something meaningful to you is described as overthinking or too sensitive, and suddenly your reaction feels exaggerated. Not because it is, but because the narrative around it has been quietly adjusted. None of this feels dramatic. That's why it's easy to overlook. The interaction still looks cooperative. You're still choosing your words freely. But if you pay attention afterward, you may notice that your original clarity feels slightly blurred, as if the conversation moved in a direction you didn't fully intend. And that's the subtlety most people miss. Manipulation rarely changes your decisions in one clear moment. It changes how certain options feel, slowly reshaping the emotional landscape until one path seems easier to follow than the others. What makes subtle manipulation difficult to recognize isn't the moment itself. It's what happens afterward. There's no dramatic conflict to replay in your mind, no obvious argument or clear turning point. Instead, you're left with a quiet uncertainty that lingers longer than expected. A conversation that felt calm begins to feel slightly heavier when you think about it later. You might notice small disruptions in clarity, the sense that you agreed too quickly, the feeling that you explained more than you needed to, the faint question of whether you misunderstood your own reaction or whether your instincts were accurate at all. And because nothing outwardly negative occurred, your attention turns inward. You start examining your own responses instead of the dynamic itself. Maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you read into the tone too much. Maybe you imagined a shift that wasn't really there. That's where the real effect begins. Subtle manipulation doesn't leave visible emotional marks. It leaves quiet gaps in self-trust. Moments where you hesitate before relying on your own perception because the interaction felt cooperative, even while something inside you stayed unsettled. Over time, those small doubts accumulate. Not enough to feel overwhelming, just enough to make you question your internal signals a little more often. And the more you question them, the easier it becomes for future conversations to guide your attention without resistance. Because when clarity softens, influence doesn't have to push. It only has to wait for you to adjust yourself. Awareness doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone around you. It means learning to notice the subtle shifts in your own rhythm during a conversation. The moment you feel yourself explaining more than you intended. The moment your tone changes to maintain harmony, rather than express what you actually feel. The moment your thoughts begin circling around how the interaction should feel instead of how it does. Subtle manipulation loses much of its influence when you stop searching for clear villains and start paying attention to patterns, especially the ones that repeat quietly across different situations. You don't have to confront anyone or label every interaction. Most of the time, nothing dramatic needs to change externally. What shifts first is internal. You slow down. You allow space between what's said and how you respond. You let silence exist without rushing to fill it. And something interesting happens when you do. The conversation begins to move at a different pace. The pressure to immediately agree softens. The need to justify yourself fades slightly, because your attention isn't being pulled entirely outward anymore. This isn't resistance, it's presence. Because awareness doesn't block influence, it reveals it. And once you begin noticing how certain dynamics feel rather than only how they sound, the interaction starts to rebalance itself naturally, without turning the moment into a confrontation or a silent battle for control. Awareness doesn't make you immune to subtle influence. It simply changes the way you move inside it. There will still be moments when you feel yourself adjusting, softening your words, choosing silence instead of disagreement, letting a conversation drift in a direction that feels easier for everyone involved. And sometimes that choice is genuine care, not manipulation at all. The difference is whether the adjustment feels conscious. Because there's an uncomfortable truth most people don't like to sit with. Subtle influence isn't something only others use. You've probably shaped conversations too, choosing the right tone to make someone more receptive, delaying a difficult point until the atmosphere felt safer, framing something gently so resistance wouldn't appear. Not out of control, but out of a desire to keep things smooth. That recognition can feel heavy at first. It blurs the clear line between being guided and doing the guiding. But that's also where clarity deepens. When you begin noticing both sides of the dynamic, the moments you respond and the moments you influence, conversations stop feeling like hidden games. They start to feel more transparent, more human. You see how attention moves, how tone changes direction, how silence carries meaning without needing to be filled. And once you recognize that subtle manipulation is often just influence without awareness, a new question begins to emerge. Not who is controlling the interaction, but what part of you decides how much of yourself stays present inside it. Subtle manipulation doesn't disappear because you learn a list of signs. It fades when you begin trusting the quiet signals inside you. The moments when your thoughts slow down, when your tone shifts without a clear reason, when you leave an interaction feeling slightly out of alignment with yourself. Those signals aren't proof that something is wrong. They're reminders that awareness is still present, even when the dynamic feels unclear. Because influence is part of every human exchange. People shape each other constantly, through tone, timing, attention, and silence. The goal isn't to become resistant to all of it. The goal is to notice when movement feels natural, and when it quietly pulls you away from your own clarity. And the more you stay connected to that awareness, the less power subtle pressure has to shape your decisions without you realizing it. You don't need sharper defenses or louder reactions. Often, nothing visible has to change at all. A slower response, a longer pause, a willingness to let uncertainty exist without rushing to resolve it. These small shifts create space where influence becomes visible instead of invisible. Because manipulation is rarely loud, it's patient, quiet, almost cooperative. But awareness moves the same way. And when you learn to recognize it, not only in others but in yourself, conversations stop feeling like something happening to you and begin to feel like something you can move through with calm, grounded clarity. If this made sense to you, you already know why you're here. We'll talk again.